Hello everybody, this is the first class of Play Like a Pro, meaning we're going to talk about chess legends and legends we've didn't discuss or we want to discuss in the future. So, this first game, I would like you to guess the player who was playing white. So d4, e6, knight f3, f5, knight f6. And actually I'm going to talk about two people, not just one, although I'll be focusing on one person. But enough talk. e4 takes knight e5. Well, kind of unusual stuff happening on the chessboard. It's not like a 21st century game, clearly. So, obviously I'm curious about the move that's winning for white, but I'm even more curious to know who's playing white. I'll give a hint for the player playing white. He is the namesake of the world champion Lasker. So his name is Edward Lasker. Yeah? You have a move? Yeah?
Yeah, so 7 I know.
Yeah, queen takes h7.
King
King.
takes h7, and then knight takes, then
Yeah?
bishop, and then king moves back to h8.
If king moves back to h8, then indeed knight g6 is a beautiful checkmate by Edward Lasker, who's actually far related to the world champion Lasker. But in the game, Sir George Thomas, who was a British champion, played king h6. Question is how to continue. Yes?
E knight g4.
King g5. Yeah?
h4,
King f4.
g3,
g3. King f3.
and then bishop e4.
Bishop e4 I take.
Bishop e2.
And if I go to g2, king g1.
And then king to d2.
So bishop e2 check. And this actually happened in the game. King g1, but if we really want to be stylish, bam, castle. And the black king is doomed on g1. So today in Play Like a Pro, I'm going to talk about two amazing players. Edward Lasker, who made this game with white against Thomas George, and also the world champion, who was world champion actually for 27 years, and his name is Emanuel Lasker. Thank you. So the second game I'm going to show you is Edward Lasker's game against Reti Richard. Reti Richard is very famous for being the first hyper-modern player of his time. The variation with knight f3, g3, and bishop g2 castles is named after Reti Richard. So e4, obviously, this was all the hype in the 20th century. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Can anybody help me? What opening is this? Yes, the Ruy Lopez, yeah, the Spanish. Bishop a4, knight f6, castle, bishop e7, rook e1. All very standard stuff. Knight a5, c5. This is in fact the Chigorin variation. d4, queen c7, knight d2, knight d7, d5, f5. Now, it's very interesting to look at games from the 20th century because some people assume that they don't know how to play chess, and that's not true. They just lived in a different time. Openings weren't developed as well as it's developed now, but they still know how to play this game. And I'd advise you to fill in the shoes of Edward Lasker, who at the time they say had a rating of 2580, which would be in like the 1990s would be like top 100. So he's a very strong player of his time. So it's white to move and try to gain the initiative. So in chess, whenever we don't understand our opponent's moves, we have to question them at the board. So that's what we should do here. That's e takes f5. So Reti just sacrifices a pawn, claiming that this d5 is just too weak. But Edward Lasker says, well, prove it to me. Knight b6, knight e4. And oftentimes in these Ruy Lopez positions, it's more important to have very active piece play with d3 than to be up a pawn or having a healthy center. Bishop f5, knight g5. Where is this knight headed when he goes knight g5? Can anybody help me with that? Yeah? Yeah, the knight is heading to e6. And it could be taken by the bishop, but most likely this bishop is going to get captured. Queen d7, g4. Forcing black's hand. And yeah, indeed, black could take on g4, but takes, king f1, and this is not sufficient for black. So he takes on c2, takes g6, queen e4. Defending the d5 pawn, and also getting ready for this knight e6 jump. Bishop g5, knight g5, queen b7. And seemingly this d5 pawn is doomed. But how can Edward Lasker conjure up a nice counterplay in this position? What's white's biggest issue in this position? Can anybody help me with that? The d5 is annoying. Yeah? Rook d1. But Rook d1 would just solve the problem. It's a legit move, but in chess, you can defend your pieces or counterattack, as mentioned before. And Edward Lasker came up with a counterattacking move here. Yeah? Knight e6, that's an idea, but he played f4. So he decided to attack the e5 pawn, therefore kind of balancing out the weakness on d5. Queen takes d5, and now white played f takes e5 first. He's happy to take the pawn later, so let's say d takes e5, queen takes e5, and when this bishop will manage to get out of its chain, not there, most likely to h6, then white will have a decent position. But Reti chose otherwise, played rook a8, queen takes d5, knight d5, e6, rook f6, rook d1. Now the idea is to put pressure on the d6 pawn. Knight c7, rook takes d6, h6, and here Lasker found a small little tactical trick which will eventually net him the full game and the point. It's white to move and win. I think knight h7 is also pretty good, but Lasker's moves is a bit more safe. Raise your hand. Yeah? Knight f7? Yeah, but there's a stronger move than knight f7. It's very close to the idea of knight h7, but it's not as edgy. Yeah, knight e4, yeah. Knight e4, and if I take on e6, yeah, knight f6 check. And Lasker won the game because if the king moves, I just take with check. And anyways, if you don't move into the check, you move away, the rook is defended. So after rook takes f6, rook takes f6, Edward Lasker won the game quite comfortably. So I showed this few games from Edward Lasker, and he was very strong, but not as strong as Emanuel Lasker, the world champion, who ruled our world for 27 years in the world of chess. And to understand his conceptual understanding of this game, I chose this game where he played Winawer. Can anybody tell me why does Winawer Simon's name is so familiar to us? He invented the French variation. Like here, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4. This is called the Winawer variation, which is christened after him. But here in Lasker played e5, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, castles, knight e4, and we entered the lines of the Berlin. d4, bishop e7. Bishop e7 is the old line. Now everybody plays knight d6 and get extremely exciting positions. Not. Instead, so Lasker played bishop e7, even though he wasn't playing the knight d6 line anyways. Queen e2, knight d6, takes, d takes, knight b7. Now, I know that this position looks fairly weird from the first look, but black is hoping to get an advantage from these bishops, having this bishop pair, and also hopes to break free with an idea of d5 later on. So we'll see that Lasker is more of a positional player and a gritty one at that. Knight d4, hoping to jump on f5. Obviously Lasker castles, knight c3, bishop c5, knight f5, and here Lasker finds a very, very typical but very strong move in the position. Yeah? d6. d6 a little bit is, the idea is correct, but it's a little bit timid. d5, yeah. And the trick is that there's no e takes d6, because boom, we'll take the knight, and then we'll be a happy camper. But obviously Winawer doesn't blunder it, plays queen g4. Now, what Lasker did? Yeah? Knight d6, I would take the g7 and you wouldn't be happy afterwards. Yeah? G6, that would be playing with fire, because your position would be filled with holes. You don't want that. That's not good. That's not what Lasker played. Lasker took on f5. Queen f5, rook e8. Very principled chess. He's immediately putting pressure on the e5 pawn. Bishop f4, bishop d4. And this bishop is actually working very hard right now, putting pressure on the e5 pawn while also pinning down this knight on c3. The only place the knight can go right now is a4 or d1, but none of them is too appealing. Rook e1, knight c5. And you can see how all of Lasker's pieces come to alive. In fact, Lasker is planning to play rook b8, hitting on b2 with a huge advantage. And it's only move 15, But Lasker is clearly in the dominating position already. Rook d1, bishop c3, b takes c3, queen c8. Now, what is really important in Lasker's games, that he's trying to find the best moves. And actually, that's the reason he's kind of the big favorite of Viktor Korchnoi and other super grandmasters. Because first, he looks for the best move. Second, he's trying to figure out what will be the long-term advantage in that position. So he's kind of trying to combine ideas of positional chess and tactical chess. Queen h5, queen a6. Now the queen is already eyeing the a2 pawn and those weak pawns on c3 and c2. Rook e3, queen takes a2. Rook c1, queen c4. Why is queen c4 such a great move in this position? Yeah?
It is pointing towards the king and threatening the bishop.
Yes. So Lasker had a nice lunch on a2. Now the queen, even though it's quite happy there, it would definitely would like to help the king on g8 in some opportune moments. Now, that task could be done with the idea of knight e6, but one knight is not enough to defend the king side. So rook f3, knight e6 comes, obviously, as he's trying to protect this g7 pawn forever. Bishop d2, rook e7, rook h3, and here comes the clincher move by Lasker. What did Lasker play here? Knight f4, I take on h7. So Winawer sneakily attacked the h7 pawn. Knight f8, well, then you jump around a lot with your knight. You try to conserve that. Queen e4. As you said, we're bringing the queen closer, so we have a safe king side. And no wonder Lasker is planning to exchange up the queens, as the endgame will be dead winning for him. f3, queen g6. Thank you for losing a tempo. Queen h4, rook d7, f4, queen e4. And after white played f4, this juicy little e4 square is just perfect for the queen. So he goes back there, g4, knight f8. Now he goes back as he forced white to make these concessions. So in general, the knight f8 idea is not bad, but he wanted to provoke some weaknesses in white's king side, and therefore he played knight f8 later. Queen f2, a5. So there's no more mate, and as Bent Larsen would say, if you have a knight on f8, you'll never get mated. And it's 98% true. You shouldn't get mated with a knight on f8, as it usually covers your h7 pawn, which is usually the weakest spot in your position. Rook e3, queen c4. And all that Lasker is going to do after defending on the king side is to promote the a pawn. a4. And there she blows. That rebel on the a line is just marching. a2, h3, c5. So after he pushed the pawn to a2, he's trying to break in the center. King h2, d4, queen f3, c6, e6. Also notice that Winawer is just trying to conjure up some attack on the other side. He might know he's losing, but he still does his best to come up with some counterplay. Takes c6, knight takes c6. But sadly, there's no entry squares on f7 and f8, and then black is just winning. Rook a8, threatening the idea of promoting, and white resigned. So this was just to show that Lasker was aiming to combine positional and tactical ideas, and that's how he became one of the greatest chess players of all time. Just one of them, there are many of them. Carlsen should be considered one of the best ones, but Lasker has a place there as he was world number one for 27 years. All right. Now, the second game I'm going to show from Emanuel Lasker is the classical one that he played against Capablanca. What is that? So, this is the second game I'm going to show that Lasker played against Capablanca, and this is a very important game. Bishop takes c6. Now, this is not as popular. The exchange variation is not as popular as before. Usually, everyone plays bishop a4. Now, what's kind of unique in Lasker's style is that he's trying to play the best moves in the position and not looking for the beautiful moves in chess. And actually, that's why he had some misunderstandings with Dr. Tarrasch, who, as Emanuel Lasker used to say, he looks for the beauty in chess while I'm looking for the strongest move possible on the board. And here again, we're going to see Lasker doesn't really bother to get an advantage. He's just trying to outplay his opponent, which might not be such a big novelty in today's age, as Carlsen actually does the same thing. d4, takes, bishop d6. Now, d4 is not the move by far. Castle is the best move here, among others. But here, already Lasker lost his advantage, but he's aiming to use this majority that he has on the king side. Bishop d6, knight c3, knight e7, castle, f4. And that extra pawn on the king side is kind of compensating for this healthy bishop pair on d6 and c8. Rook e8, knight b3, f6. And what actually I think made Emanuel Lasker, one of the biggest champions is that he was following no rules. He was following the rules of trying to find the best move in any particular position. So it's white to move and come up with a very good strategic plan. It was quite unique at the time. This plan was new in 1914. There are some rules in chess. First rule being, if your opponent has a bishop pair, try to exchange one of them so he doesn't have or she doesn't have one. Also, if you feel your opponent's pieces are active, try to restrict them. Now that's what Lasker did in this position. Yeah? f5, indeed. And this bishop on c8 is kind of terrible. Not green anymore, it's actually quite red because it's terrible. It's useless. So he played b6, but Lasker continued with his plan. How did he continue? Yeah?
Bishop f4.
Yes. With the idea of exchanging of that nasty bishop on d6, which could be nasty if it comes alive on e5. So Lasker was quick to exchange it off. Bishop b7, and now, strangely enough, this is a little bit inferior to the idea of taking c5, and let's say bishop b7. And in the long term, black tries to go knight c6, knight e5. And black has an okay position. But Capablanca was trying to follow rules that didn't apply to this position and played bishop b7. Because in general, do we like doubled pawns? No, we don't. But strangely enough, in these Ruy Lopez positions, these pawns on c7 and c6 sometimes prove to be useful. coming back to this example just for a second, this c5 pawn actually takes away this d4 square, which is so pivotal in these Ruy Lopez exchange variations. So bishop b7, Lasker took on d6, he takes d6, and knight d4. And now what's Capablanca's main issue in this position right now? Yeah? Yeah. Pawns are weak. And also this e6 square is a huge hole that Lasker is going to use to full effect. Knight d4, rook d8, knight d6, rook d7. Also, apart from being very passive, black being very passive, the knights feel very comfortable in this half-closed position. I wouldn't even call it half-open, because only white has this line open for him on the D line. This bishop is kind of a sorry sight on b7. It doesn't do much. Knight c8. That's already a sign that something has gone wrong. Rook f2, aiming to double. b5, rook d2, rook e7, b4. b4, Lasker is kind of using a method that is well known in Nimzo-Indian variations. You get rid of your bishop and try to post your pawns on squares that are opposite to the opponent's pawn, opposite to the b7 bishop. King f7, a3, bishop a8, king f2, rook a8, g4. On the other hand, as black has no chance of getting close to these pawns on the king side, white is trying to expand over there. h6, rook d3, a5, h4. White is patiently advancing. A takes, rook e7, king f3, rook g8. Let's stop here for a second. Let's imagine we're black and we have this position. What would be potentially the best idea to do here? How could black try to fight on? What move could provide Capablanca some chances for survival? Because this is kind of those moments when Capablanca had his last chances of fighting on. Yeah.
Like doing that, like trying to maneuver your knight, so like knight e6 and then knight e6.
Yeah, that's kind of difficult because the d6 pawn is always hanging. All of our pieces with black are very passive. And one of the things you can do when you have a passive position is at least try to get rid of the active pieces of your opponent. So that's what Capablanca could do here. But what move would do that? Yeah? Yeah? d5? d5, that would just ruin the structure. Yes?
Rook takes e6.
Yes. Rook takes e6 was the last chance to fight on. Because even though black is down material, at least he got a little bit more active. Most likely he's going to lose the game, but at least he can put up a fight. Rook g8, king f4. And also notice that Lasker is not rushing with any pawn breaks. He's getting ready for the idea of breaking through. Rook g3. He could play ideas like g5, but there's no rush, so he doesn't play that. g5, king f3. G takes h4 doesn't threaten anything, because I just go rook h3 and then pick up all those pawns. So that wouldn't work. Knight b6, h takes g6, rook h3. Now, Emanuel Lasker has an e6 knight, which is very strong, plus a rook on h3 on the only open file apart from the A line. So very soon, the journey for Capablanca will end. Rook d7, king g3, king e8, rook h1, bishop b7, e5. And in order to activate this knight that wasn't doing anything, he even sacrifices a pawn. D takes e5, knight e4. And now this is just too much for Capablanca's position, as the knight is headed towards f6 and knight c5, and even knight d6. Knight d5, knight c5. Already winning material, bishop c8. If the rook moves, we can just check and collect material, then that's just over. Bishop c8, knight d7, rook h7, entering the 7th rank. And now what white is trying to do is to go around again and just collect everything. King d8, rook a8, bishop c8, knight c5. And Capablanca resigned because knight e6 is coming. And even knight b7 is deadly. So Lasker won the game. So in this game, Lasker showed his skills, that he can win any type of positions just trying to look for ideas that are very uncomfortable for his opponent. And I feel that Capablanca wasn't accustomed to this situation, and that's why he lost so badly in this game. So I want to show two more games. One of them played against Tarrasch himself. Now, I wouldn't say that Tarrasch is worse in this position, but look at the way Emanuel Lasker will try to put pressure on Tarrasch's position. Let's look at this position the first time. Which pawn can become weak in this position for black? Potentially. Yeah?
C7?
C7 maybe, yeah, in the long run, yes. Yeah? A7. Well, A7, from practice I could tell it's hard to get there. Yeah?
F7?
F7, that's firmly defended by the king. That's the problem. Yeah?
E5.
The E5 one. The E5 one. So, noticing that the E5 pawn could be potentially weak, Lasker starts with H4. Rook D6. How did he continue? Yeah? H5, well, that wouldn't help the idea of undermining the E5 pawn. You're trying to find a move that will create a weakness on E5. Yeah? G5, yes. A very strong move, and this is high Grandmaster level. I'd even say super Grandmaster level. Black usually wants to defend the E5 pawn with F6, so it has control over the E5 square. Now, on the other hand, the E5 pawn will become isolated, so it will become a potential target in the future. H takes, F6, rook G1. Lasker doesn't take on F6. He doesn't want to help this rook to activate. So he says, okay, if you take on G5, good for you, but I'm not going to activate your rook and let it into the F file and F4. F takes, rook takes, knight D7, C5. I'm not sure that white was any better in this position. Most likely king F6 would have been much better. But knight D7 gave this option of C5 to create a weakness on E5. E5. This is a pawn sacrifice, but for the pawn, white will get something. What will white get for the sacrificed pawn? Did I see a hand there? Oh no, I thought you raised your hand. No. So what does C5 create apart from putting some pressure on E5? Well, it activates this D3 bishop, which was very bad before. C5, B takes, bishop B5. Now, compared to the first position, the initial position we saw, we have two amazing pieces on g5 and b5. And white might even start thinking of getting better, because both of these pieces for black are pretty bad. King f6, rook g1, knight f8, a4. Getting ready to advance this pawn, and might dream of becoming a pass pawn in the future. Rook b6, king d3. Where is that king headed, I wonder? Well, it's headed towards the c-pawn. So Lasker, with the use of attacking the e5 pawn constantly, he created another weakness on c5. And in chess theory, we say if your opponent has at least two weaknesses, you can win the game. So knight h7, king c4. And now white is clearly better. Knight g5, rook g4, knight f7, king takes c5. The reason white is clearly better is the fact that he has an extra pawn on the queen side, while also having by far the better pieces compared to the black pieces. Knight h6, rook g1, g5, a5. And the problem is for black that there's no way that he can stop the white king from marching forward. Rook d6, bishop e2. I mean, rook d6 stops it, but then I'll be able to attack your pawns through this b7 square. c4, knight f8, bishop g4, bishop e6, rook a6, king b5, rook b1, here it comes, king c5. And now out of desperation, Tarrasch took on e6, but that's basically a non-move. After, say, king f6 or king h5, really doesn't matter. I have rook b7, and I'll just gobble up this pawn on c7, and this pawn on d5 will just march forward. And there's no way of stopping that. So you could see how he won an equal position, or maybe even slightly worse position, just by trying to eliminate a bad pawn for himself and also trying to create as many weaknesses for his opponent as possible. Now, I want to close off with this game, another game that he played in the World Championship match against Tarrasch, where he actually comes up with some opening ideas in the Winawer French. d5, knight c3, knight f6. Now everybody plays e5, but in the past even Alekhine played bishop g5. Bishop g5, bishop b4, e takes d5. A very rare move. Queen takes d5 to modern standards. Knight f3, c5, takes, queen d2. And even though analysis from that time, so in the 1920s, 30s, they claim that this concept that Emanuel Lasker was choosing here is dubious. It's not quite true. It's quite playable for white. They claim that knight e4 is just brilliant, but that's not quite true because I play bishop d2, takes, b takes. Bishop takes c3 is a no-no, and these French structures, the bishop is just terribly placed here. So you should take with the c pawn, and even though it's doubled, at least it's a central pawn. So that kind of compensates here. And c5, bishop d3, takes, queen takes, castles. And these positions are equal, but with mutual chances, anyone's game. So let's say knight c6, queen e3, and white has decent chances of getting an advantage. But black has no reasons to complain either. Okay, but Tarrasch didn't go for that. He went for the principled c5 move. Takes, queen d2. I always like these unorthodox ways of defending pins this queen d2 move actually threatens this idea of knight takes d5. Because even though, let's say bishop d7 takes, even though you take with check, king takes d2, e takes d5, d takes c5, and apart from being a pawn up, I will have an eternal knight on d4 after knight d4 and knight, what is that? So knight d4, and this will be an eternal knight there. So Tarrasch was forced to take on c3, takes, knight d7, rook d1, rook g8, d takes c5, queen c5, queen d2. And actually, this position reminds me of the game played between Carlsen and Anand, where Carlsen pretty badly outplayed Anand. And similar to this game, black will have trouble developing, because you can't really move the knight because of ideas of queen d8 mate. So Dr. Tarrasch is forced to make some moves and concessions. Queen b6, c3, a6. And now I'd like to ask, how should we develop our pieces in this position with white? Yeah? g3, indeed. He played queen c2 first, but after that he played g3. The problem is for white that he cannot really go to e2 yet, because the rook would take on g2, and you don't want to give a free pawn. y4, queen c2, f5, g3. Now the bishop is going to this healthy square of g2, while it will take some time for this bishop to get out from this terrible square on c8 and move it to b7. He can do it, but it will cost him a lot of time. Knight c5, bishop g2, queen c7, queen e2. He wants to have a firm grip on this e5 square, therefore he plays queen e2, b5, castle, bishop b7. And to be honest, I feel that Lasker totally outplayed Tarrasch in this position, as he has a huge lead in development. And if you have a huge lead in development and your opponent is not castled yet, it's high time to do some action. And that's what Emanuel Lasker does here. He plays c4. Why does he play c4? Can anybody help me? What's his idea of c4? What's his goal? Yeah. Can you repeat? Yeah, create a file. At least put a pressure on this diagonal, on this line. And also, the black king is in the center. That's what you wanted to say?
No, I thought like the black pawn's a little weak on his side.
Yeah, that too, that the pawns on b5 and a6 are pretty weak. So Lasker hits the iron while it's still hot. b4, queen d2. Again, as you pointed out, he puts immediate pressure on the weak pawn. Rook b8. Dr. Tarrasch is being tricky, because queen b4 wouldn't quite work because of bishop takes f3, and it would be a discovery. But Lasker looks for a different target, and that move will put even more pressure on Tarrasch's position. So white to move, and white gets the initiative. Whenever you're looking for a potential move, always think about where you can find your opponent's weakest spots. In this position, where can you find the weakest pawns? First, we were attacking this pawn on b4, but then the black rook defended it. So we need to find a different plan this time. Yep. Yes, queen h6. And even though this pawn is not worth too much, but it is a weakness in black's position, and it's extremely close to Tarrasch's king. No wonder that Tarrasch panics and just exchanges off his most beautiful bishop, which is actually a no-no. He really shouldn't have done that. Takes, queen e5, rook e1. And even though Lasker is not famous for sacrificing, when he sees the chance for an attack, he'll jump at it the first opportunity he gets. Queen takes b2. And now Lasker finds the key move that will just make his attack decisive. Yeah?
Bishop c6 check?
If bishop c6, the king can move to e7, and it's not yet over. Yeah?
Is it a rook sacrifice?
That would be a little bit early. Because of this good defender on c5, these sacrifices can be dangerous for the one who sacrifices. Whenever attacking, you always need to bring some more pieces into the attack. Bishop h5. It's an idea, but that's not what Lasker played. Yeah?
Bishop d5?
Bishop d5, well, I'll most likely play rook b6. So what Lasker played was queen f4. And they were many tempting moves, and I understand that, but Lasker decided, okay, I don't really need to get into detail yet, because if my queen drops on d6, this game will be over. So I think it took him like 5 or 10 seconds to find this move, as if the queen does enter on d6, the threat of bishop c6 will be just brutal. And indeed, he was correct. Rook c8, queen d6. Now bishop c6 is quite hard to stop f6, but if you stop me from playing bishop c6, yeah, then I call plan B and play bishop h5. Rook g6 takes, and rook takes e6, and that clinched the game. And Tarrasch resigned, because after rook takes c6, the queen will just take, and queen takes c8, and that would mean game, set, match for Emanuel Lasker. And thank you for coming by. Thank you.